Hello, everybody. Oh, you know what? Let's go ahead and go to that layout to start off with. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Weuve. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I'm here with Chris Carlson, and this is Starfleet Tactical. So thank you all for joining, and thank you, Chris, for being with us tonight. Chris, do you have an employer? You are an employer. So that means that you are sort of one of the few people on the show that actually does
speak for his employer.
That is one of the differences. We may have the same first name, but that is one of the differences between the two of us. I do not speak for my employer. Okay, now that we got that out of the way. I had to say that this weekend because I was at the Origins Gaming Convention yesterday, and I got to say that many different times to various people as I was talking at the con. But it was fun. I got to see Larry very, very briefly, but they did a really good job of conspiring to make sure that Larry and I weren't available at the same time to go see each other's events. So he and I literally were in rooms right next to each other giving 2-hour presentations. So how about you? What have you been up to?
Working on High Tide.
Ah, that was the same answer as last time.
Yeah. Going through and making sure we get all the target descriptions correct, because right now they're not.
So, well, any idea on how long that's going to take? Do you have a target publication date that you're willing to talk about?
Larry wants to get it out by the end of the month. That's possible. I would say definitely before Historicon in mid-July.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good. I look forward to seeing that. So tonight, Chris is on board. That we're going to talk more about the thing that we talked about the episode before last, episode 140, which was my idea about how you would take the terms amphibious and littoral and translate them into science fiction, space navy type terms. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And I showed Chris my presentation earlier, and he said, "You want to share with them what you told me about it?"
I said it read very much like a JSIDS document, which is a joint capabilities.
He meant as a big compliment, because there is nothing in the Department of Defense that is more entertaining than a JSIDS document.
More vacuous than a JSIDS document.
Well, okay, there's all right. So that's a fair enough point. JSIDS is Joint Capability
Integration and Development System.
So basically, JSIDS is the process whereby DoD defines requirements, because it's actually hard to build something that costs $1 billion and takes you a program employing hundreds of people over the course of 10 years to get to the point where you're ready to actually turn it over to the factory to build, right? It's actually hard to do that. You got to specify everything to make sure that you get exactly what you want, et cetera. Like a ship is a big deal. Mm-hmm. And so JSIDS is the process whereby you scrub those requirements so that you make sure that you get what you need. And Chris and I both worked at an office in DIA that was part of that process. We did not work there at the same time. He hired me to be his replacement when he retired. But we were both part of the JSIDS process. And so when Chris says that my document reads like a JSIDS document, he knows what he's talking about. And that made me realize that I never have really explained why my presentations look the way they do, because many of my presentations are very word heavy. They don't have a whole lot of illustrations, et cetera, and they could definitely be better in those terms. But I would say there's 3 reasons why they are the way they are, and I want to explain those to you. One is that there's a lot of just-in-time presentation development. So it has I haven't done this recently, but there have been times where I've finished my presentation at 9:30 and I was going to execute it at 10 o'clock. So there's not a whole lot of time to practice and develop it and find extra things to make it look pretty and stuff like that. So sometimes it's just because you're effectively seeing the first draft. So this is a crowd I'm willing to share my first drafts with. The second thing about all that is that until I've actually done it once, I'm improvising the voiceover until I've actually done it once. I don't fully appreciate what the right words are to go on the screen. I've got some idea, but a lot of times if I were to go do it again, it would change a lot. But those are really just sort of excuses. Those are not features. Those are bugs. They're bugs with explanations, but they're bugs. Here's the feature. We do, as a general rule, Starfleet Tactical is an hour to an hour and a half. And I can easily imagine that somebody might come and want to be able to get either an overview of the presentation, or they might want to go back and find a particular part of the presentation. And by the fact that I put together slides that have words on it, it means that you can move the slider and you can scan through the document very quickly and find exactly where the thing you're looking for is. So it's basically, I treat it like a table of contents, so that people can find stuff quickly. Tonight, it's even more so than most, because tonight it's really kind of speaker notes for myself. It's just a tiny bit more than a list of topics that I think that we should discuss. I'm not really fully making the argument, in part because I want to have that conversation with Chris. So because Chris has been doing this a long time. Chris has been doing this longer than I have, because Chris didn't have this situation where the Cold War ended and he had to go find a job in the computer business for 10 years. Which is what I ended up having to do. So I spent the 90s as a computer geek. I spent the 90s as what I would tell people that I'm the nuclear weapons expert at a small internet software company. And Chris has actually done presentations on littoral warfare before. In fact, he sent me one. I thought about calling an audible and just saying, "Hey, Chris, why don't you do your presentation tonight?" Decided against it. But there's a lot of good stuff in there, and that's exactly the sort of stuff that I want to talk about, Chris. So we should talk about that as we go through this. So anything else before I go ahead and pull the slide deck up? Anything else you want to say?
Nope, let's march on smartly.
All right, marching on smartly. So that is not the layout I want. Hold on a second. I think that's the layout I want. So I created a new layout because the StreamYard added the ability to do that. So I created a layout that lets us be a little bit bigger. And so let's go ahead and march on smartly. So this is part 2. Let's call it a new taxonomy. Technically not quite the right word. It probably should be a new vocabulary. The thing about taxonomies is they're mutually exclusive classification schemes. Maybe that word doesn't work, but I think taxonomy sounds better than vocabulary, so I just went with taxonomy. Here's the somewhat Chris-centric schedule. So 2 things of note on this schedule, 2 things that have changed. First of all, no show next week, and that's because I've decided I'm reading through the Bob Work stuff on LCS. There's a lot there, and I'm following some of the footnotes, and there's a few other things I want to read. And when I add it all up, I kind of concluded that, and I'm going off to a conference next week, the Origins Wargaming, the Connections Wargaming Conference. And so I'm going to be basically busy from sun up to sundown. And so I figured that the right answer is probably discretion is the better part of valor. Let's aim for the 6th of July on that. And I will adjust that so that Chris can be there, because he's got some thoughts on this. I know we've been talking about it. And so if the 6th of July doesn't work for you, Chris, we can coordinate on something else.
I think that's good.
So we'll narrow down when we get closer to the holiday. The next thing is you'll notice that I now say, and I used to say next 3 shows. I changed that to next 3 topics because I realized that some of the topics could be more than one episode. And I don't necessarily know that until I'm putting the presentation together. There's been a, like for instance, I didn't think Amphibious and Littoral and Orbital, et cetera, was going to be, I thought that was one show until I started putting it together. At that point, I realized it's 2 shows. It's clearly 2 shows. Arguably, it could be 3. And so I went ahead and changed that to next. These are what I think the next 3 topics are going to be. So we're going to talk about Robert Work and LCS and sort of where it ended up and run it through the science fiction converter. So previously I've talked about LCS, but this one, we talked about LCS previously, about how that program worked out. This is going to be a little bit more analytical. The idea is I want to look at, here's what Work said, and here's how it worked out. And how do we think about that in science fiction terms? Because there were different failure modes. There's different things that are important in telling that story. One is, here are the theoretical underpinnings. The second is what the Navy actually decided to do, not the theoretical underpinnings, but what the Navy actually decided to do. And then there's what the Navy and the vendors actually did. So, for instance, you can agree with Bob Work on everything he said about why we should build LCS and still conclude that the Navy had the wrong design. And then not only was it the wrong design, but the vendors built one that was full of bugs. Stuff broke too easily, right? So it could have been a good idea, poorly implemented, could have been a bad idea, et cetera, et cetera. I want to try to look at some of that stuff and then run it through the science fiction converter. The topic after that, I think I'm going to look at is what do we mean by capital ship? There's an interesting article that Michael Vlahos wrote for, I forget what journal he published it in back in like 1979 on what does the word capital ship mean. Might have been in the 1980s. Might have been about the time they were bringing back the battleships. And so it's an interesting article that I've had in the back of my mind for a while now, and I've wanted to do something with it. So I've decided now's the time. In part because that's a smaller project. And so I should be able to bang that one out while I'm researching the topic after that, which is the Traveler Navy stuff. And basically what that boils down to, everything that Martin Doherty ever wrote for Traveler. Because Martin Doherty is a British defense analyst, and he gets it. He gets it. And he's done more to sort of make Traveler make sense in real world terms. The Imperial Navy in particular makes sense in real world terms than anybody else I've ever read. And so I want to go through a bunch of his books, and he's got a thing called Sector Fleet that was later redone as Grand Fleet. No, it started out as Grand Fleet. It was redone as Sector Fleet. There's the Imperial Navy, and then there's a campaign book. And I want to go through all of those and sort of look at the stuff he did. So, and maybe by then I will have the 3D printed Traveler ships that my friend Brian Haven is printing for me. So he's already printed the Fiery class Gund Escort, which is my favorite Traveler ship of all time, and which I've talked about on the show before. And so we were talking earlier today about the range of ships he's going to print for me.
My son printed me a Gazelle close escort.
So I'm going to get a Gazelle too. And these actually, he's printing 2 of each. One is what they call tactical scales. So it's really sort of board game scale.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is 1/270. And so the Fiery class Gund Escort is a Gazelle with a streamlined hull, basically. And so I want to have. I
think they're a lot different in size.
No, they're the same in size.
Because the Fiery was a gunship, wasn't it?
So is the Gazelle.
Well, it's called a close escort.
Yeah, their terminology is kind of whacked in that regard. Like, for instance, like the patrol cruiser is a cruiser.
As the
Patrol
anti-high
cruiser is a
lightning.
cruiser more in the same way that the police have cruisers, and then in the way that the Navy has cruisers. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about, because one of the things that Doherty understands, I've talked about Corbett and the battle fleet versus the flotilla. And basically, Doherty takes a very Corbettian approach to describing the Imperial Navy. And the key thing to understand is that some of those ships are part of the flotilla and some of those ships are part of the battle fleet. And like, you would never take a Gazelle into a fleet action. You would never take a Fiery into a fleet action, or a patrol cruiser into a fleet action. That's not what they're there for. They're there to do sort of workaday naval stuff on the peripheral in the littorals. They're there to do that sort of stuff, and they're there to do like counter piracy and Coast Guard type functions, what Americans would describe as being Coast Guard type functions. And he argues that basically fighters fit in that same category too. And fighters in that universe, as he describes them, are kind of more like helicopters in our universe, right? Mm-hmm. You want to beef up the capability of a Coast Guard ship, add a helicopter. Put some torpedoes on, or Penguin missiles or something like that. Put an armed. If you took a Navy helicopter and put it on a Coast Guard ship, a Coast Guard cutter, now it's got some offensive capability that it didn't have before. Doherty basically makes the argument that that's standard in the Traveler universe. You've also got some weirdnesses on Imperial versus colonial squadrons, and the colonial squadrons are basically system defense forces that have been deputized and stuff like that. And I'll go into all that stuff. Rob Davidoff makes the comment that he finally did his homework and reread Forster's The Good Shepherd, and so he can watch the Tom Hanks Greyhound movie. And I will admit, I haven't read The Good Shepherd, and I haven't seen the whole Tom Hanks movie. I need to.
The Good Shepherd's not a long read. It's a pretty short book. And
yeah,
you basically have two scenes.
Yeah. I saw a bunch of the clips that were online, and remember that movie came out like right at the beginning of COVID. So you couldn't go see it in a theater. I saw the combat scenes that were online. I thought that there was a couple of things about putting him in that role that they could have done a better job explaining it. And there was a couple of things that they could have, that there was a couple of places where it's like, is that really the maneuver that you would want to do? Although at least with one of them, I realized, yeah, it probably is. And the one that I realized, because at one point there's a scene where he's maneuvering to avoid a torpedo. And I kind of look at the geometry of that and I go, why doesn't he just speed up? He just sped up. Mm-hmm. And then I realized, after thinking about it for 2 years, I realized that it was he doesn't have gas turbines. So if you were in a modern destroyer, the right answer is to say speed up, and the helmsman, or the lee helm, if they actually had a lee helm on the bridge for it, which they probably would because they're at battle stations, the lee helm would shove the throttles forward, and the jet engines down below would immediately go to full power, and the variable pitch propellers would immediately respond, and they'd start speeding up right away. Mm-hmm. That's a lot different than calling down on a voice tube or sending an engine telegraph saying, yeah, we need some more steam, so we need to go faster, so pour on the speed. And it also occurred to me, he may have just been going about as fast as he could, and he sort of was eyeballing it, because we as the audience have a much better view on that torpedo than he as the CO does, because he's seeing it on a flat surface, whereas we're getting a bird's eye view. So okay, I kind of decided I'll give Tom Hanks the benefit of the doubt in that regard.
Although, given that sea state and his angle of view, I don't think he could see it.
Well, but he was reacting to it.
I know, because it was in the script.
Oh, well, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. The other thing that I thought they should have done is they should have made a point of saying something to the effect of, like, he was a retired guy that they brought back on active duty, because Tom Hanks is a little bit old for the job they had him in.
Mm-hmm.
But if they could easily explain it, like, yeah, he's been retired for a few years. They recalled everybody to active duty, and they're giving him a ship, and so he's hasn't been there for the first part of the war, but he's an experienced guy, and that's why they're willing to slot him in, is because he was an experienced guy. And so they sort of threw him in the deep end, but he, at one point in his life, he had been a pretty good swimmer, so they were okay doing that. That would make a lot more sense.
It actually would have been more compelling if they had made him a commander then.
What was he?
Captain.
Yeah. Or maybe he had been. Is there a way that we could retell that story where he's a Commodore?
Please, let's not do that again.
Okay. All right. So we should, in any event, back to this slide. This is what's going on. I'm going to talk about Traveler. It's going to be great because I love Traveler, and I've been wanting to talk about Traveler for a while, and I've decided it's finally time to do it. Okay. So last time we talked about how the space is not an ocean. Now we're going to talk about what we mean by the terms amphibious and littoral, and what I think the alternatives to those are. And I think the alternatives to that is interface and orbital, or at least I'm going to propose those as alternatives. And there's really only a few slides in this, because these are really kind of reading notes for Chris and I to sort of riff off of, more than anything else. So let's get to it. Okay, so a couple of caveats. First of all, we talked about the fact that these are my slides and not Chris's slides. So throw rocks at me, not him. All the standard caveats applied, not trying to ruin anybody's day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm neither an amphib guy nor a littoral guy. All of my time at sea, with one exception, was spent doing anti-submarine warfare. The one exception, I was hanging out with the independent duty corpsmen, and the goal was we were going to test some software in a Palm Pilot, and that didn't end up working out the way it did. So I got to watch a lot of sunrises on the bridge of an Arleigh Burke, and I didn't even think to send my clearance, so I couldn't even go into combat. And the reason why I couldn't really do the thing I was there to do is because their network was broken. So I couldn't even I couldn't even send an email back ashore saying, please send my clearance, because I got nothing to do and I want to go hang out in combat. So that was a totally unclassified trip. I did get to hang out with an independent duty corpsman and sort of figure out how the world works for those guys. So that was kind of cool. But like I said, neither an amphib guy nor a littoral guy. I have seen a landing craft. I've been on a LCAC ashore, so I've seen what an LCAC looks like. I've been on an amphib. I did a tour when one came to Newport, but haven't been on an LCS or anything like that. This is intended as a conversation, not a presentation. So these are really kind of speaker's notes. And I expect that I'll probably come back to this topic again after I sort of process a few things. This was really, a lot of this was sort of starting the ball rolling. I'm interested to see where it ends up rolling, both tonight and in my head. And it's also important to say that we're kind of mixing our types of nouns here, our categorization. And this is one of the reasons why taxonomy doesn't work. In that I would argue that littoral and orbital are domains. They are places where you would fight. Whereas amphibious and interface are warfare areas. They are types of warfare expertise. They are types of missions. And so there's a lot of overlap between littoral and amphibious, in that amphibious warfare takes place in the littoral domain. And so I'm very aware of the fact that these are not, these are complementary terms, they're not exclusive terms. So, Chris, would you have anything to add on that?
I'm not sure interface is a warfare area. Interface is a transition between domains, if you will. If you were to say amphibious assault and planetary assault, then assault is the warfare area. Amphibious and planetary are just explaining the medium that you have to transfer the troops through.
Yeah, planetary might work better than interface here. The one place where the reason I didn't go with planetary, because this is actually we are diving into notes in my notebook that have been there for 10 years for this idea. I came up with this idea of calling it interface about 10 years ago, or maybe even longer. I may have been at the War College when that idea first came to me. And I thought at one point, I started trying to write down words that I thought would be a good equivalent there. And I settled on interface over planetary in part because, everything's planetary. And I wanted to get across. Amphibious gets across the idea that you're going from the sea to the ground. You're going from the sea to land. Mm-hmm. I wanted to have something that got across the idea that this was the warfare. This was the warfare area that was about going from space to the ground. And planetary, it's like if you said planetary army or planetary forces, that doesn't say to me that they transition from one to the other. That says those are the guys on the ground when I get there. And so, but, not a hill I'm willing to die on. And that's part of the reason why that particular one is, there isn't a good enough word. I even thought about just sort of saying like, well, they still call it amphibious, even though it's not, even though amphibious technically means something else. In the same way that, in Aliens, you have colonial marines, and my guess is none of those guys are anywhere near the water. And so marine is kind of a weird term for them, right?
Just means a ground force guy assigned to the Navy.
Yeah. Well, they're part of the Navy, right?
Absolutely. They're a projectile we fire at shore.
Every Marine who hears this is now there's steam coming out of his ears.
Blame Jackie Fisher.
No, but my point there is that they when you say that in front of a Marine, they always say, no, we're part of the Department of the Navy, but the Navy itself is a separate force. I get to listen. I get to listen to. I have some colleagues that are in other services that wear blue, who have recently bifurcated into the one department, two services model that the Department of the Navy has. And there's some, every now and then there's some like, wait a minute, huh? Like all of a sudden the difference between Department of the Air Force and Headquarters Air Force is suddenly really important in a way that it wasn't 5 years ago. So, okay, so let's talk about characteristics of littoral warfare. And this illustration is way too small for anybody to see anything in it. That's okay. This is really sort of part of the narrow definition of the littorals as a shore or coastal region. The Navy sort of and the Marines sort of split it up into things like the surf line and this and that, and the high water mark and the low water mark, et cetera, et cetera. That's really important if you're trying to actually get guys on shore. Not so important if you're a littoral combat ship and you're out doing your thing with the more expansive definition, which really sort of focuses on the continental shelf going in and extending on to the land under the direct control. That should be fire, not fair. Fire and maneuver from the sea. That comes from Bob Work's discussion about littoral combat ships. That it's about, okay, if my weapons can range there, then it's part of the littorals.
Well, if you're going to do that, then the littorals are awfully big because Tomahawk's got long legs.
Yeah, I would argue in this case, Tomahawk's more, I don't want to say strategic because it's not, but
just say strike and move on.
Yeah, it's deep strike. I would say deep strike is different than shallow strike. So battleship guns, certainly relatively short range land attack missiles. Yeah, that's kind of where it works. I mean, none of this is a precise term. And it wouldn't be the first time that the definition of what you cared about changed when your ability to affect things changed because you got a new weapon system, right? There was a time period where we defined the territorial waters of the country by how far a gun could shoot, and the answer was 3 miles. And then all the guns got better and they could shoot to 12 miles, and so we changed the definition of territorial waters. And by we, I mean the human race. The international community changed those definitions, so it wouldn't be the first time. And those environments, it's a complex interaction of environments here, because you've got IR clutter in the background. When you're looking towards the shore, you've got weird things happen with wind, weird things happen with noise. There's lots of coastal traffic. There's lots of biologics. There's lots of junk in the water, because the closer to shore, the more likely there is to be, is that a mine or is that an old microwave oven that somebody dumped off, took out on their boat and dumped it at sea because they didn't want to pay the fee that the local government was going to charge them to actually dispose of it. So maybe they just dumped it off their fishing boat at sea or something like that. And so it's a very complex environment. The deep sea environment is complex, but nowhere near as complex as the littorals. And then you also just have water depth issues, right? So if you've got something that's got a 40-foot draft, you got to be very careful about how close to shore you get it. So any thoughts on that?
No, I think that covers just about everything. The only thing I might suggest is the Navy likes to use water depth kind of as their benchmark.
Yeah.
And I'm more inclined to use distance from shore, because all their arguments center around distance from shore.
Yeah, and the problem is, this is a very Navy thing to do. They're trying to keep track of 2 variables, but only keep track of 1, right? Because the 2 variables are area of effect, which is defined by the length of their weapons and the length of the other guy's weapon shooting back, right? Mm-hmm. And that's really a distance sort of thing. But then they're also trying to not run their ships aground. And by running their ships aground, I don't just mean the standard, running their ship aground, which is bad, right? And the other thing about shores is that they change. There's always sand being moved around. And so a big storm came through and now there's a sandbar where there didn't used to be a sandbar. The hurricane put a sandbar there, right? And so these things are constantly changing. So you kind of want to stay as far out. But even if you're not risking actually running aground on something, you also don't want to get your water intake so close to the sea bottom that you suck junk up into your water intakes, because now you've got to clean that shit. And you also don't want a situation where water depth affects your speed, what you can do. It functions as a speed limiter, in that if you try going too fast and too shallow a water, the ship will squat and you end up banging your rudders on the seafloor. And that is, to use a technical term, bad. Mm-hmm. Especially if you're a captain of that ship and you want to get promoted. So,
yep.
Yeah, there's all sorts of interesting interactions with the seafloor and your propulsion system, and what shallow water can make you go faster up to a certain point, and then you have to slow down because of squat and things like that. And there's also you end up with things in the Gulf, where if you're in a submarine, and you can't get deep enough underneath a ship. As a ship goes over, it pulls you up into the ship. That happened with a submarine in the Persian Gulf around, 2007?
I don't remember the exact year, but I remember the incident.
Yeah. Bill Murray and I were talking about that. We were reading all the newspaper reports, trying to figure out exactly what happened to that sub, because it had, like, as near as we can tell, what happened was it got pulled up, it got rolled over in its side, and then the propeller went whack, 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 whack along the length of the hull and carved a bunch of grooves into the hull. That's sort of what seemed to be the case based upon what the newspaper reports were saying. So I never did see the final on that. So, and for everybody out there, you might be wondering why I'm saying littoral as opposed to littoral. And the answer, to put it snidely, is because I'm speaking English. Because the word is actually littoral. I do occasionally say littoral. But it's not a particularly common word. And when people start talking about the littoral combat ship, a lot of people just didn't know how to pronounce the word, and they started pronouncing it littoral. And, I shouldn't be that snide about it, because the language, dictionaries are a description about how the language is spoken. They aren't a guide to speaking the language. They are a description about the way the language is spoken. So if enough people decide that the word is pronounced littoral, it's now pronounced littoral. In the same way that data did not exist until Patrick Stewart invented it. Before that, it was data. And I say data probably 2/3 of the time, even though I know that I should be saying data. So, any thoughts on that, Chris?
Nope.
All right. One of the things is, I know that the people who first started talking about littoral warfare, because I met a bunch of them at the War College. They came to some of the events we did. The one guy, I can't remember his name. I could pull him out of a lineup. I can't remember his name. He's one of the guys you'd recognize the name if I could remember it. His comment was, I don't know where this littoral thing came from, or littoral thing came from. We all said littoral. So, okay. So, some characteristics of amphibious warfare. So amphibious warfare is really about getting people that are on your boats, people with guns on your boats, from the sea onto the land. In this regard, the Navy sort of has 3 missions. It's the bus driver. It provides logistics support. So it takes them there, sends them on their way, gives them supplies when they need supplies. That includes maintaining the sea lines of communication. And then they will sometimes provide fire support, either in the form of air sorties coming from ships that have airplanes, or in the form of gunfire. So can you think of anything else that fits in that category?
The Navy also provides medical support, also provides communication support.
I was kind of wrapping that into logistics, but yeah, it makes sense to talk about that stuff, especially in terms of the US Marine Corps in particular. They do not have their own chaplains. They do not have their own dentists. They do not have their own doctors. Mm-hmm. All those things are provided by the Navy, which, I can be lean and mean too if I can offload a big chunk of my responsibilities onto another service and it comes out of their budget. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of the Marine Corps, but I'm not particularly tolerant of the we're lean and mean, we do more with less argument. They frequently either by design, other people pay their bills, or they're just so bad at paying their bills that somebody else has to cover the check. It's like the Marines are the guys that consistently forget to bring their wallet. And as a result of that, you end up having to cover them. And I got to see that at DIA a few times too, with one of the duties that you used to have that I took over, and the Marines were constantly asking us for money. Mm-hmm. So, In the modern era, an amphibious assault involves specialized craft, landing craft, boats that are designed to take troops and gear ashore. We've all seen landing craft that have flat ramps that come down at the front. There's also other ships that are designed to beach and have big bow doors that open, and other variations of that. Like right now, the Navy's working on a lighter type system that is a stern door with like armored skegs covering the propeller shafts and stuff. But the idea is that it's going to back up to shore. And the reason why it does that has to do with keeping the pilot house away from the machinery space and increasing the field of view, because the pilot house is all the way forward rather than all the way back. And it also means that they can optimize the bow for better seakeeping and better speed. And as a result of that, they can increase the performance. But it does mean that this thing drives up to the shore and apparently does a 3-point turn and backs ashore. And I look at that and I kind of go, okay, that'll be interesting to see how that works. There are apparently ferries that do that. But the idea that they're going to do it with a combat craft strikes me as being perhaps a little ambitious. Now, the counter argument, I think, to that is, do we really think that anybody's going to be doing an opposed assault? And there's a lot of people that believe opposed assaults are a thing of the past, that at best, the assault will be on an unopposed beach. I'm a believer in, if you get rid of the capability, then you know that there will be no opposed assaults. And the bad guys know that there will be no opposed assaults. And as a result, you do not force them to be in a position to oppose an assault. The Marines during Desert Storm did a great job of tying down a couple of divisions because they just hung around offshore and looked like they were getting ready to come ashore. And as a result, Saddam Hussein had to honor the threat by maintaining forces in a position where they could oppose them. And if you don't have the capability to do something like that, then, you're sort of handing a free pass to the other guy.
Well, part of the reason why they've been talking operational maneuver is to do exactly that, to not attack strong points. The other unspoken thing about is that the Navy and the Marine Corps do not have the units to really engage in such attritional warfare. We just don't have the ability to do it anymore.
Yeah, and that's the problem with my argument, because my argument isn't really that you would do it. My argument is more along the lines of, you have to threaten to do it. And if he doesn't honor the threat, then you can do an unopposed assault, right? But the credibility goes out the window when it's like, look, I can see your cards. I know you're bluffing. I can see your cards, guy. I can see your cards. So I'm glad you brought up operational maneuver from the sea, because that's an interesting concept, the idea of applying maneuver warfare to the maritime campaign. And so the idea, and related to that, is this idea that this was a big deal, say 2005-ish, and that was ship to objective maneuver. The entire idea that you're not, the way that traditional amphibious assaults would work is that you would move all your guys onto the beach, and then you'd sort of muster on the beach, and then you move ashore and you move inland to do your thing. And the entire idea about ship to objective maneuver is, maybe I don't have to go to the beach. Maybe I can do like an air assault and I hit targets deep inland. And the beach phase, the over the beach phase, is the second wave logistics phase oriented phase, not the first wave assault phase. And so this is the point where I would like to talk about something that we talked about in the phone earlier, which is the movie Starship Troopers, or at least the book Starship Troopers.
Yeah, really.
Because so I am, shall we say, not a fan of the movie. I think the scene, and specifically I'm talking about that first drop that Johnny Rico does, where they drop on Clondathu, and the Valley Forge has a collision with the Ypres in orbit, and most of Johnny's unit is wiped out. And the way that we see that happen in the movie is that they've decided they're in a NASCAR race and they're all bunched up together. It's like Michigan or one of the other super speedways, Michigan or Talladega, and they're all bunched up together, and somebody takes a hit and swerves out of line, and they have the big pileup. I always thought that was a dumb scene in the movie, because that just tells me they're not particularly competent if they're flying their spacecraft like that. Mm-hmm. Because that was going to happen. But I can tell a good story, I think, as to why that happened in the book. And I was inspired, this explanation came to me, I was inspired by the idea of ship to objective maneuver. And so in my head canon about that story, what's really going on is they're trying to get a drop on the bugs by not doing a standard assault. In a standard assault, they would come into orbit, fight their way into orbit, come out of drive, but they'd have to like dress their orbit, dress their formation, and that takes time. So it means they're probably not going to do their drop on the first pass. They won't do their drop until later. Whereas I think what they were trying to do is they were trying to get forces on the ground so fast that the bugs didn't have a time to respond. And so what they did is they came out close to the planet, and the idea is they're going to come out and start spitting pods out right away, rather than whatever preliminary maneuver they would normally do. And it turns out that was a bad idea, because two ships came out too close to each other and they ended up banging. So that's the explanation I can come up with as to why that happens, because otherwise I look at it and go, why did that collision happen? That collision never made sense to me when I read it. It's like, aren't you guys paying attention? And so this is an example of, I finally could come up with an idea by applying ship to objective maneuver as to why that might have happened. So
that whole formation in the movie made no sense.
No,
they were way too close.
There's a whole bunch of things that make no sense. The entire movie is problematic, and I think I've actually done my Starship Troopers talk on the show before, like a long time ago, like episode number 40 or something like that. Olive says it's probably been almost 40 years since I actually read the book. I don't remember it well. It's worth rereading. When the movie came out, 1997, when the movie first came out, I sent an email out to almost everybody I knew and said, look, the movie sucks, but the book is fantastic. If you have never read the book and want to, let me know, and I will buy a copy of the book and send it to you. And for years, it's been a while, but for years I got lots of feedback on my webpage on Starship Troopers. And I did buy books for people because they'd say, like, there was this kid in the Philippines. He said, I can't find a copy of this book here. I can't find a copy of the book. And so I bought a copy. And I figured as long as I'm sending it to the Philippines, I might as well send a hardcover. So I bought him a used hardcover of the book and had it drop shipped to the Philippines. So, and then I got an email from him saying, oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So I've probably bought and given away 10 or 15 copies of that book over the years. Oh, the last thing on this page is the Cadiff Cliff debate, which somebody tells me that they finally have a doctrinal solution to the Cadiff Cliff debate. And so the Cadiff Cliff debate goes, it's about who's in charge. The commander of the Amphibious Task Force, who's a Navy guy, generally an admiral, because it's a big force, right? There's a lot of Marines, there's a lot of Navy ships, so you're probably dealing with a Navy admiral and a Marine general. Or who's in charge? The commander of the Amphibious Task Force or the commander of the landing force? Now, everybody agrees that when the ships are far out at sea, the Navy guy's in charge. Everybody agrees that when the Marines are ashore and it's a land campaign and the Navy is just supporting the Marines, that the Marines are in charge. Where at what point does the baton get passed was something that the Marines and the Navy argued about for 50 years.
I think they were arguing about this in World War II.
Yeah. So and at least so probably more like 70 years then.
Yeah.
70 years. So they were definitely arguing about this. And so when I was at the War College, this is a good example of the difference between the Marines and the Navy. The Marines are only about a third the size of the Navy, and you would think that the Navy would totally dominate the Department of the Navy, and it actually doesn't work that way. And that's because the Marines punch above their weight class and the Navy punches below their weight class. And here's an example of that. There was a disagreement between the Navy representative and the Marine representative during one of the 3-star meetings that they have each quarter. And the Department of the Navy had a policy that said that there will be no daylight between the various constituent services of the Department of the Navy. And if there's ever a disagreement that comes up in the tank in this meeting, that they will have worked it out by the next quarterly meeting. And so this issue came up. They made a note of it. They went to the commandant and the chief of naval operations, and they said, "Thou shalt game it in Newport and figure out what the right answer is." The Marines, being the Marines, immediately stood up an ad hoc task force to address this issue, assigned people to work the issue, and started working the problem. They wrote position papers. They got everybody indoctrinated as to what the Marine position was going to be, blah, 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 blah. The Navy waited for 2 months, maybe a little bit more than that, and then called up Newport and said, "Oh my God, we need to do a game next week." Now, I wasn't part of this, but only because I was scheduled to go to Norfolk and teach a couple of classes for the College of Distance Education. Otherwise, I would have gotten a chance to see this, because this turned into an all-hand event for the wargaming department. They threw all the bodies at it. But the Navy basically just sort of randomly picked guys wearing uniform and said, "Okay, you're going to this." And my colleagues who saw it said that basically what happened was there's this week-long game, 3-day-long game, something like that. And the Marines marched in, walked up to their Navy colleague, everyone picked a Navy colleague, grabbed him by the collar, and then for the next 3 days just did this back and forth across the place. Because none of the Navy guys had any idea why they were there. They didn't understand the issues, et cetera, whereas all the Marines had been working the issues nonstop for like 2.5 months. That is the difference between the United States Marine Corps and the United States Navy. So this is the sort of issue that comes up, and I imagine that when we get to talking about interface combat and orbital versus littoral, I would imagine that it would be an issue there too. Okay, so here is an amphibious ready group with a Marine Expeditionary Unit. So the amphibious ready group is the ships, the Marine Expeditionary Unit is the dudes. And as you can see, there's a couple of big ships, 3 big ships. This doesn't include whatever Navy escorts are along to provide air defense and stuff like that. And then they've got a lot of helicopters and landing craft and a lot of guys. So you can't really read the numbers there, but suffice it to say, this is a major operation involving a lot of people, involving a lot of gear and a lot of capital investment. So Chris, thoughts on that?
If you take the chance to look at the displacement, the amphibious assault ships alone is about 80,000 tons.
Yeah, they're big.
And their job is to put about 2,100 Marines ashore with 15 days of supplies. Okay, so when you say this is a capital investment, boy, howdy is it.
Yeah.
And that's not, as you said, doesn't include whether or not there's an aircraft carrier or, a battle group supporting it. Then it gets even bigger. But this is why I think you can make the analogy between amphibious and planetary assault, because it's all about getting personnel from the hull to the ground. All that changes is the medium by which you're crossing.
Yep.
Now, if you're doing amphibious, you're using the air cushioned LCACs or the LCUs, LCMs, which are fairly large landing craft. They're not small, and they travel on the water. Now you've got a vertical envelopment aspect. You can do airborne assault. Well, then you're using helicopters and aircraft. When you get to planetary assault, it's kind of a mixture of those two. You have small ships that have to transport from space, go through air, and either hover or land to drop off the troops.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. I mean, I'm going to do something I never do, which is I'm going to use a Star Wars example. Star Wars has anti-gravity capability at the level where they can just plop a Star Destroyer over a thing and it could
Basically.
and they can start spitting out things and probably just use tractor beams to lower them to the ground. In Doc Smith, you saw stuff yanked in on tractors all the time. Mm-hmm. They would use tractor beams to move units from one location to another location, move ground units. In Renegade Legion Centurion, I don't know if you ever saw this in any of the games. It might have been in Prefect, but it was certainly in the Centurion novel that was written, one of the novels that was written about the ground forces, where when they did an interface assault, their grav tanks were in effect airplanes, right? They moved at several hundred miles per hour, and they could get up to a certain altitude. They were sort of limited. They had to be close enough to the planetary surface. So we're talking like, 1,000 feet or something like that was what their limit was. They never flew that high because it just made them a target and you could shoot at the underside that wasn't as well armored. But it did mean that when they did a planetary assault, they just lowered the door and they rolled out and did a reentry. They had, I want to say they had like a reentry shell, and they would enter into the atmosphere, and then their grav field would have, their anti-grav would have more and more influence, and eventually they'd slow down and they'd be able to land. And so I remember it as being a very interesting scene to read. I haven't read those books in 30 plus years, so maybe if I reread it, I'd decide it was goofy. So, and you'll all note that for a show called Starfleet Tactical, I haven't mentioned Star Trek at all today, and there's a reason for that, and that is because with transporters, none of this matters. So I don't even think about that. I mean, maybe in terms of orbital combat, it might. We'll talk about that when we get to that point. But in terms of the amphibious side, it really doesn't matter. Okay, so Orbital is an analog to Littoral. I would argue there's a bunch of similarities, and there's one major difference, and this is by no means a complete list. The similarities are, first of all, I'll skip down to the bottom and talk about Cadiff Cliff. First of all, I think it's likely that there's the same sort of issue as to exactly when that turnover happens. So, there's probably arguments on both sides as to who's in charge. I would expect that to be the case. You have the situation where the domains limit sensors and weapons while magnifying threats. And by that, I mean, it gives the defenders an opportunity to hide. They can hide behind the curve of the Earth, or they can hide behind on either a shore or on the ground. It requires specialized doctrine, probably when you're in orbit. This idea that you're doing fire support from that area to the other area probably works. The difference, I think, is that orbital forces are moving. And so it's not like you're just camped 20 miles offshore. It's going to be moving. And so it's a much more dynamic situation.
I'm not sure you can really say that. It's
Okay.
more dynamic from the planet perspective, but if you consider the planet the beach, then the starships are just as fixed to the objective as an amphibious group is.
That's true. If you consider the entire planet as being the objective,
yeah,
and you could go even if you don't, you could be in geosynchronous orbit. So that's a good point. That's a very good point. And I haven't used the phrase "everything is assumptions dependent" yet this talk, so now is a good time. Everything is assumptions dependent. For instance, I'm pretty convinced that a lot of times in Star Trek, hey, I am going to talk about Star Trek. A lot of times in Star Trek, the ship isn't really in orbit. I think a lot of times what's going on is the ship is using its warp engines, especially in the original series. It's using its warp engines to maintain a location relative to stuff that's going on the ground, which you would expect to be trivial for it to do, right? It's got a lot of excess power, and you can force an orbit. You can force something that looks like an orbit, but technically isn't, because you're not in free fall. So, yeah, as Olive says, whether or not you actually have to obey orbital mechanics changes a whole lot.
If you got the power, it don't matter.
Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of cases like that. In fact, I've even come up with a term for that. I think the term for that is anchoring. Anchoring is when you use your space distortion drive to maintain a relative position to something on the planet, whether you're in orbit or not. Yeah, Rob's got a good comment. I just checked the manual for what our delta V is, and it says yes. I like that a lot. Okay, so interface as an analog to amphibious. So we're talking about space to ground instead of sea to land. I would say that the interaction of the domains limit sensors and weapons while magnifying threats, same thing as with before. For essentially the same reasons. It also is going to require specialized doctrine, and I also expect the Cat of Cliff debate to be of relevance there.
You will probably also have specialized equipment.
Yeah, that's true. You would have specialized equipment. And I think I thought of a difference and forgot to put it in, but I was having a hard time coming up with things that were really, well, I guess the main difference is you don't have to deal with the water and all the effects of the water. It's, in a lot of ways, it's easier to deal with air. Speeds are a lot higher. Like if you're doing
the distance compensates. So your cycle time is probably darn close to the same.
Yeah, that makes sense. Your time to get to the beach and back again is probably about the same.
But yeah, I mean, not having to deal with weather, I think that's a big plus.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of, I think there's command and control issues are trying to think of what I meant by that. I had an explanation as to what I meant by that. Now I can't remember what it is. Must not have been very good.
Well, command and control gets back to your Cat of Cliff.
Yeah. It's back to Cat of Cliff.
And, the big thing, I think the easiest way to define it for these guys is once in orbit, the landing force is making the calls. While approaching and getting there and dealing with defenses, your Navy hierarchy is making the majority of the decisions. And there is a point at which there's a lot of debating as to when the Cat of Set thinks he's secure enough in his position to be willing to become fixed to the planet and thus transfer control over to the marine component.
Yeah, it's a lot different situation if the naval force doesn't have to be in a supporting position all the time, right? If they can just sort of do a drive by and shoot them ashore and then retreat out. Now, traditionally, at least in the United States Department of the Navy, the Marines get kind of cranky when the Navy does that.
Very much so.
In fact, it's been 70 years, guys. You can let it go now. Close to it's been 80 years now,
yeah.
actually. You can let it go now. Yes, I know the Navy abandoned you in the shore of Guadalcanal, but
we did pretty good elsewhere.
Yeah, and they didn't really abandon them. They just went off they temporarily left and then they came back. And the thing is that the Marines never give the Navy any credit for being willing to run a couple of battleships through the strait at night. Which, every book says, don't do that.
Do that.
Right? They've violated every possible doctrine. In every alternative universe where the doctrine was different, they violated it too. But Halsey knew that he needed to do it, and Willis Lee was the guy to do it, and so that's what he did. Incidentally, that's one of the things on the list of things to do is to read the Willis Lee biography and turn it into a Starfleet Tactical episode, because Willis Lee, I have not read that book yet, and even without reading that book, Willis Lee is my favorite naval officer, I think, of all time, certainly in World War II.
I still lean towards Spruance.
Spruance is pretty good. And I've got a lot of things about a lot of favorable views of Halsey too. But I think Lee's my guy. My guy. So, but let's see. Wright saying good things about the book. And he says Lee and Nimitz are his two favorites. And so, yeah, Nimitz is a pretty good one too. So, okay, so this is certainly not a comprehensive list of my concluding thoughts. But one is that it makes sense to have specialized vehicles for orbital warfare, bombardment platforms, and also sensors optimized to the environment. And this is another one of those things that goes to the mantra that I come back to, which is it's all assumptions dependent. What the world looks like is a lot different. What you need on a ship is a lot different if your concept of operations is that you come out of hyperspace around the orbit of Pluto, and then you spend the next 3 weeks using your magic fusion torch to get to the site of the battle. If that's the way everybody operates, then the gear you have doesn't look the same as the ship can show up like at any place, and I need to be able to do a quick fire shot at it, right? I need to be able to rotate my ship and shoot my weapon as fast as possible because he's going to do the same thing to me. And so when you start thinking about orbits and the planet being in the way and lots of satellites, potentially some of which are space colonies with non-combatants, and the fact that you're in you might be in radiation belts and electromagnetic fields and stuff like that you wouldn't have to deal with farther away. There might be moons with weapons emplacements on them, et cetera, et cetera. When you sort of add all that stuff up, it seems to me that you're going to need some special sensors. You're maybe going to need some special weapons in order to deal with that. By bombardment platforms, I mean, if you're, space is the high ground. If you're in orbit, at least in theory, you could be using stuff to shoot at targets on the ground. Although the thing about, if I'm firing a naval gun from 10 miles offshore, the time of flight is what, 30 seconds tops?
Yeah. About.
Yeah. So maybe I have to be a little bit farther out for it to be a full 30 seconds, but that's the order of magnitude we're talking about. So at least in theory, from calling in the fire mission to a big boom could be as short as 2 minutes. If everybody's waiting for it to come in, it's like, yep, we're ready. All right, roger that. Okay, go. Could be really, really fast. If I'm in orbit and I'm going to drop something down from orbital speed, I probably can shoot at anything anywhere on the planet. If I'm using an energy weapon, yeah, maybe I can do that in 2 minutes. But if I'm like using rods from God or a missile or something like that, I'm probably, or railgun round, we're probably not talking about 2 minutes. We're probably talking about tens of minutes in order to get ordnance on a target.
And that's not a bad thing, because you can't have the same proximity of the weapons that you do in, say, destructive fire from naval platforms, where, if you're a few thousand yards away, you're good, because all those other weapons you're talking about from orbit have a much larger area of effectiveness.
Yeah, although if I fired relatively small kinetic weapons, relatively small shells,
then it's still got to be big enough to survive reentry.
Well, that's a good point. It has to be big enough to survive reentry. And I assumptions dependent. I can handle. It's made out of unobtainium, and it gets colder the more energy you pour into it, or something. Whatever. So this actually, in my mind, this has the effect that under a lot of different types of assumptions, you still need to have fighters or some sort of support craft optimized for atmosphere, because you might still have to have something that looks like air support. Just because I've got a ship up in orbit with some big guns that are designed to shoot, that doesn't necessarily mean that solves all the problem. Right now, I will mention here, Glenn, there's a book by Glenn Cook that's one of my favorite books of all time, and it's called Passage at Arms. It's his version of Das Boot. And so it's basically a World War II submarine story. But one of the characters on it is a reporter who's on this stealthy craft, and he had gone to the Naval Academy and had been roommates with the guy who's the skipper of this boat. But the reporter had medicaled out because he had been injured while stationed on something called a bombard. And the idea behind the bombards were they used rail guns to shoot at ground targets from orbit, and they would shoot in 4 directions at the same time. So you'd get time on target. Well, not necessarily at the same time, but they'd shoot in 4 directions. So you'd get time on target attacks coming from 4 different points on the compass. You can run, but you can't hide.
It's a neat trick.
It would be a neat trick. And it's one of those tricks that, it sounds really, really good when you read it in a science fiction novel. And then you sort of sit back and think about it and go, I think that's harder than you think it is. I think that's way harder than you think it is.
No, but one of the things that when we get to where you talk about specialized vehicles, I think your initial assault troops, you're looking more at powered armor, because armored vehicles are too big. They take a lot of space. That's a lot of volume. So it's almost like if you had a need for tanks or whatever, that would be follow-up.
Yeah, and there's a book by a guy named Robert Frezza that, as near as I can tell, he's written like 4 or 5 novels. They all came out in like the 1990s. And the 3 of them were a trilogy, the first of which is A Small Colonial War. And I remember that they make a big deal in that book about how the force they send to fight a ground campaign is very, very small. right? They're sending it to a colonial situation. They're sending forces from Earth to go deal with an upstart colony. And it's a very, very small force. I want to say it's on the order of like a company-ish.
That's pretty small.
But the comment made was, it's so expensive to ship stuff interstellarly. And the most expensive thing by far is life support. And so mass is an issue, life support is an issue. So they only send the very best, right? They are cutting edge in everything they have because they know they can't send enough bodies. They can't send enough gear. So the gear they send is all grade A quality stuff. It is as good as it can be for the amount of mass that they're willing to spend on it. And so, you know, there's no cheap stuff there. It's all really expensive. And so you end up with local forces that are making do with whatever they construct locally. And then the guys coming in from outside are all have just fantastic gear.
40K Space Marines.
Yeah, kind of. Which reminds me, I keep meaning to point out, I put that guy in the background like 9 months ago, and I keep forgetting to point out the fact that I bought this thing.
And
it's a Dark Angels. I'm going to pick him up. It'll be tough to get him back in his. He doesn't want to stand right. So Dark Angel.
Yes.
A Dark Angel Space Marine. I got him on Amazon for $17. It's funny. There's like 4 different Space Marines you can buy. This one's $17. All the other chapters are like $50. And it's still that way. I checked last week and it was still $17 and all the others are $50. And I have absolutely no reason. I don't understand why. The only thing I can think of is that they made like 10 times too many of these guys and they got a warehouse full of them. But I keep meaning to point this out to Alec when he's on, that I just sort of set him in the background. So I probably would have bought an Ultramarine. I would have bought a Salamander if they had a Salamander, but they don't have any Salamanders. They only had the more popular chapters. I think they had Space Wolves. I think that was the other one too. So let's see. There was something else I was going to say that the Frezza book got me thinking about. Yeah, you're talking about powered armor. There's also the issue of, do you think that powered armor works? Because there's 3 options to that. It doesn't work at all because you just can't make it work. It works, but it's got some serious limitation, like the batteries only last for 2 hours. Or, you know, Starship Troopers, where you go running around and stuff, running, jumping, climbing trees the entire time, and you can just wear it for months on end. And that's one of those things that the assumptions really sort of matter as to whether you're going to do something like that. If it does work, I still love the drop scene in at the beginning of Starship Troopers with them getting fired out of the gun, getting fired like giant shells.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that's as good a way to do it as any, because my guess is it's really hard to make reentry stealthy.
Very.
So
kind of an IR flare.
Yeah. And so the Starship Trooper solution is to junk up the scope with a lot of different things. So they can see it all and they just don't know which one is something that they actually want to target. And that's as good an explanation as any. Okay, I'm going to run through and see what people have said and if there's any questions that I should answer. Okay. Okay. Good Shepherd. We talked about that. Yeah. Rob Davidoff says about the Good Shepherd, it's funny structurally. The book is only 3 chapters long.
It is. It's really short.
That doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah, so going through here. Okay, right at one point said, normally us in the Gator Navy think of them as ballast, and I'm not quite sure what he was talking about, but probably Marines.
Yeah, he's talking about Marines being ballast.
Yeah, the USMP think of us in the Navy as lifter hooper. Yeah, I mean, there's the aviation community says that too. I mean, I knew a naval aviator who was a naval flight officer. He had a bumper sticker in his car that said NFOs have their very own chauffeurs. And of course, all the pilots in the Navy referred to the NFOs as self-loading baggage.
I think that's a broadside comment somewhere.
Yeah, probably is. Broadside, for those who haven't seen it, is a comic book, a cartoon strip done by a guy named Jeff Bacon, who Brian McHugh met him at sea when Jeff Bacon was still in uniform.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, he did an exercise with him. So Jeff Bacon was a naval officer, and he did this cartoon on the side about naval and marine life. I forget what the marine one is called. It's got the word green in the green side, maybe.
I don't remember.
Broadside was the Navy one, and he's right on the money. He's right on the money.
He does publish some books. I've got a couple of them.
Yeah, he has published a couple of books, and
they're good. They're really fun.
And I remember seeing one that showed up on an exercise. It was an enlisted guy briefing the admiral on what the schedule for the exercise was, and it went like this. He said, one, comms break, fix those. 2, something else breaks, fix that. 3, get our act together. 4, fight red. 5, beat red. 6, best they've ever seen, yada, yada, yada. 7, pull in the port a day early. At which point the admiral says, you forgot blue on blue. And it is not the case that every exercise I ever saw had a blue on blue by any stretch of the imagination. But they all had the potential for it.
Of course.
When I saw guys turning off safety procedures because they had situational awareness and they knew what was going on, and it's like, have you thought about this use case? Because I just thought of something that could totally screw up your calculations, and I haven't heard any of you guys mention it. Like one time they debated for 45 minutes about what they were going to do, and then they didn't do the time distance calculation for how far the unit could have moved in 45 minutes before they decided to take the shot.
Oops.
Yeah. So that happens. Okay, so scrolling through. Lots of good discussion here. But nothing that looks like something I need to specifically address. Littoral Genie sounds like a Pacific Rim mech. I agree. So I'm going to comment on Pacific Rim and then we can call it a day. I saw I think it was the second Pacific Rim movie, and I was really surprised about some of the cool things that were in that movie. And it was specifically the idea that everybody knew these mechs, right? They were all famous, and they had fan clubs. And so when the one new pilot who sort of got drafted because she had like built her own mech, when she got drafted into it and she goes to the hangar for the first time, it's like, oh my God, that's such and such. Oh my God, that's such and such. She was doing the total fangirl thing. And there was just something about that extreme level of enthusiasm that I really, really liked. So I need to go back and see the first one because I never saw the first one. So, all right. So, Chris, any final thoughts for this evening?
It's all about getting troops from the hull to the ground. It's only how you do it that matters.
Yes, that is indeed true. One of the reasons why I came up with these terms is because I started doing some thinking about this is because I think it might show up in some fiction at some point, either mine or somebody else's. And so I wanted to be prepared to have that discussion. Because it is all about getting them ashore or on the ground, on the dirt. So it's a topic I imagine I'll come back to. My guess is I'll actually probably at some point pull this together into something I can do at cons.
Actually, I think your best chance of actually doing something with this is when you dig into Traveler.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's worth this will almost certainly come back up when we start talking about Traveler. When I start talking about Traveler. So that makes sense. So all right, I think that's it for tonight then. So with that in mind, thank you very much for being on the show, Chris. Thank you to everybody who came and watched the show. I'm always very appreciative of the fact that there's a group of people that decide that they'd like to spend their Saturday night with me, and whoever I have on board with me that night. And so thank you very much. Lissa, if you're listening, I hope your air conditioner is working. And we won't see you next week because next week I'm going to be recovering from being at a wargame conference for all week. But I plan on being available the week after, and we'll talk about, hopefully if Chris is available, we'll talk about Bob work at that point. If not, I'll do the capital ship talk instead. So with that in mind, goodbye, everybody.
Good night.